Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, you're in the right place because we're all about albums. Okay, before we get started with today's video, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce a new segment that we're going to be doing on each video, which is the unknown album. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a portion of an album cover. I'm not going to show you the whole album, either the front or back cover, because it's too easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a portion of the album that you should be able, hopefully, to identify the album. I'm not going to show you obscure albums that sold, several hundred copies. I'm going to show you albums that have sold tens of thousands, if not millions of copies of albums. Very, very popular, well-known albums. So let's see how you do. All right, here we go. The first unknown album for today. Okay, you think you got that? All right, we'll see next week if you know. Here we go, number 2. Okay, both of these albums are very well known and have sold lots and lots of copies, so hopefully you can figure them out. For those of you who saw my first video, you may have thought to yourself, he's talking about albums, but he's showing us the back cover. What the heck is all that about? Well, I did that on purpose. This will be an extra segment. So I showed you this album, a very famous album, the back cover of this album, and here it is. See if you can identify that one. And I did one other one. I showed you a vinyl back cover. Here it is, the back cover of this album. Another pretty famous album. Both albums are a little bit on the older side, but they sold a lot of copies, and hopefully you can figure those out. And again, I'll give you those answers on our next video. On this video, I'm going to talk about the decade of the 50s. Why the 1950s? Well, it's the birth of rock and roll. So what better decade to start with? And at the end of the video, I will give you my choice for the one album that best represents the entire decade. I know, a tall order, but let's see how I do. Well, rock and roll did not develop overnight. Rock and roll obviously is standing on the shoulders of all the music that came before it. The roots of rock and roll can at least be traced back to the 1920s, possibly before. But in the 1920s, an artist by the name of Mamie Smith recorded a song by the name of Crazy Blues. And Crazy Blues is considered the first blues song, even though it did not really have the chord structure of what a blues song is. And blues is one of the main foundations of where rock and roll was built upon. Now, blues was taking off mainly in the cities of Memphis, in the Mississippi Delta, New Orleans, and in Chicago, and it generated many stars both early and later on. These blues performers were very important and instrumental in the foundation for rock and roll as we know it today. Some artists, including Charlie Patton, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and many, many others. Now, rock and roll is not only blues, it fused other forms of music too. Now, in rural white America, there was no one really recording any of these folk type tunes, which basically featured fiddles and guitars and singing. But some enterprising individual from a record label decided in 1927 to hold an audition for talent in 1927 in the city of Bristol. Bristol, sort of on the border between Virginia and Tennessee, and lo and behold, a lot of people came out to try to audition to become famous and make a lot of money. This portion of America was very, very poor. This did generate some actual early stars. One was the Carter family, and they are basically the backbone, the foundation of country music. Also, they had Jimmy Rogers, which is another early star of country music. Moving over now to Texas, where they had what's called Western Swing. Now, Western Swing was another musical form that was fusing other forms of music. It fused white country music with the blues and jazz music from the North. Now, what jazz music brought to it was the idea of a larger band that can play. Also, they had used more instruments, including drums, as well as horns, like saxophones. And this gave the music a driving beat, a danceable type of music. And so this was another development. This music actually morphed later on into with hillbilly music, as it was called, into what's called rockabilly, which is an early form of rock and roll. And this is sort of what Elvis was listening to and what he based his music on. Finally, and most importantly, we have gospel music. They didn't call it gospel back then, but it was church music. And in the black church was different than white church. Why? White churches typically had more money. They could afford a piano or an organ, and that's how the music for singing was based upon. However, in the black churches, which could not afford a piano or an organ, they had to do with other types of instruments which are cheaper, including the drums, the guitar, and different horns. And this, again, sort of like Western swing, gave a rhythmic beat to what was being sung. And there was a call and response type of sound that was developing in gospel. And this was also instrumental in the development of rock and roll and the type of singing that was used, as well as the beat that was produced. So we have blues that fused with the black popular music, and together this formed rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues was a precursor to what we now know as rock and roll. The first rock and roll record is actually in 1951. It's called Rocket 88, and it was performed by Jackie Brenston. Now, Jackie Brenston was actually a soloist who sang and played saxophone in the Ike Turner Band. Ike Turner never got any credit for the first rock and roll song, but there it is. It is Rocket 88 in 1951. There was other types of music going on as well. Late in the 40s and even into the early 50s, vocal groups, quartets were very, very popular. They sang in great harmonies. But what was happening now was gospel music was fusing with it, with popular music, and these vocal groups started taking on this more danceable, this more rhythmic rhythm and blues. And one of the early quintessential bands of rhythm and blues was the Dominoes. And the Dominoes featured a young 19-year-old artist named Clyde McPhatter. And he was sort of larger than life. He sang with his heart. He was very emotional. Many times he would be on the floor at the end of a song weeping. He was so giving of himself. And this was a classic style that led to rock and roll, and you can see where some of the singers today take note of Clyde McPhatter. We then had a family from Mississippi, very poor family, that moved to Memphis, and this was the Presley family. And at the age of 13, Elvis Presley moved to Memphis, and he basically wasn't a very popular kid. He was more of a strange type kid. In high school, he was not very popular. He dressed flamboyantly, had a crazy hairdo, carried around the guitar all the time, and liked to sing. He was trying to get himself in different bands, but was not very successful. After graduation from high school, he went to get a job, earned a little bit of money, but his main focus was he wanted to sing. He wanted to do music. And in the city of Memphis, there was a recording studio called the Memphis Recording Service. And if you had a couple bucks in your pocket, you can actually record a single. And that's what Elvis did. For $3.98, you can record a single with two songs, one on each side, and they would hand you the acetate at the end of the recording. For an extra $1, if you had that much money, you were able to actually get the tape. They would actually run a tape of the original recording, and you would get to take that with you as well. Elvis did not do that. However, during his recording session, which occurred in August of 1953, the woman who was listening, who was the secretary of Sam Phillips, Marion Keisler, she, and I probably butchered her name, I'm sorry, but she actually thought that he had an interesting voice and thought he was a good ballad singer. So she actually started a tape recorder, which they never do. She didn't give the tape to Elvis. They hang on to it and wrote something like "Great Ballad Singer Hold" or something like that, and they stored it. And later on, she played it for Sam Phillips. He thought he might be a ballad singer. He didn't love Elvis's sound and tried to get Elvis some gigs here and there and brought him into the studio. Nothing ever clicked. Finally, in 1954, he matched Elvis up with a young up-and-coming guitarist who was very talented named Scotty Moore. Scotty Moore and Elvis got together, rehearsed, tried different songs in Sam Phillips' studio, and nothing really happened. And the story goes sometime in July of 1954, during a break of the recording session, Elvis started goofing around and he started jumping and hooping and hollering and banging on his guitar and started singing "Well, That's All Right," an older blues song. And Sam Phillips kind of came running out of the studio door and said, "That's it," something like, you got it. What, don't lose that. We got to capture that moment. And so, do it again. And so Scotty Moore and Elvis got together, and the band tried to redo that moment, that feeling of "That's All Right." And that song was recorded, and I think that's the real beginning of music that Elvis would emulate, and his music was then spread among the masses into the white teen population. Then in 1955, he signed with RCA Records, and he went on to record, apparently, I think they said 14 consecutive million sellers for RCA Records, which is quite incredible. Elvis went on to be one of the most popular singers of all time, sold I believe over 140 million records during his career. At the time of his retirement, only the Beatles, I believe, had more records sold, which was in 180 million, give or take. But Elvis is obviously one of the great singers who really got rock and roll to the forefront. Another interesting thing, in 1955, a movie by the name of Blackboard Jungle was released, and not only in the US but in Europe as well. And a song that was featured there, or the title song, was "Rock Around the Clock." It was performed by Bill Haley and his Comets. Now, this song is a lot of times credited as the first, I should say, a rock and roll song, which it obviously wasn't. It was Rocket 88 in 1951. But this is the first rock and roll song that became a hit by a white artist. So, "Rock Around the Clock," not the first rock and roll song, but the first white hit rock and roll song. We do have a few other individuals we have to talk about who were very important in rock and roll history. Those included Chuck Berry. Now, Chuck Berry recorded many important songs for rock and roll. His first big hit was "Maybelline" for Chess Records out of Chicago, and that went on to be a #1 rhythm and blues record. He later on had other big hits, some of them because they were recorded by the Beatles, "Roll Over Beethoven," "Rock and Roll Music," and finally his other big hit, "Johnny Be Good," which became immortalized in the film Back to the Future. We do have a couple other artists. One young man who was known as Richard Penniman was in New Orleans trying to record rhythm and blues songs, was not being successful. He sent off a demo tape to a gentleman at Specialty Records, Art Roop, and 7 months later he got a message from Art Roop that he was interested. "Come on down and we'll record you." And just like Elvis, he had roots in gospel music, which Elvis did as well. And this gentleman was goofing around again during a break. Nothing was working, and started banging on the piano and started singing on the top of his lungs. And the immortal words came out, "A wop bop a loop bop, a wop bamboo." And yes, Tutti Frutti was put down, and that was the start of Little Richard's career. We also have one other important artist that people usually don't talk about, which is Fats Domino. Fats Domino, who's a New Orleans artist, piano player. At the age of 14, he dropped out of school, and Fats Domino was on the music scene, and in maybe around the age of 20, 21, he was discovered by a band leader by the name of Dave Bartholomew. Now, Dave Bartholomew took him under his wing and they recorded many successful songs together. Nowadays, Fats has dropped down in the standings due to all these new artists, but he still is, believe it or not, number 17 all time, and he's placed between Bruce Springsteen and Madonna, so that's actually pretty good company. You know, I gotta make a pick. You know, what's going to be the album that describes the entire 50s? You know, I think even though we've got the blues and we've got gospel and rockabilly, I think rock and roll, what started, what became the hit, the national, the world sensation was The King. Obviously, Elvis Presley. And I think we're going to choose his first album. It's just called Elvis Presley. And here you see the cover. This is an iconic album cover. It has those, just says Elvis Presley in bold, bright colored letters, and with him in black and white singing. And basically he's saying, "Here I am, world. I'm all here. You've got me now. I'm going to change everything." And he did. First song on that album was Blue Suede Shoes, interestingly enough, written by a young man named Carl Perkins, who was another artist for Sun Records, which Elvis early on recorded for with Sam Phillips in his studio. Well, that's my pick, Elvis Presley, his first album to represent the 1950s. Let me know what you think of my pick in the comments below. Before I end, however, I am also going to give you my pick for what I consider the greatest album from the 1950s. When I thought about it, it didn't take me too long to come to the conclusion of the 1950s, and I did not pick a rock and roll or a pop album or a crooner album. You know, you had Sinatra, you had a lot of people to think about, but I thought without a doubt this album is the most well-known album in jazz history. And yes, you've guessed it, it's 1959, and it's Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. This album is the #1 selling jazz album of all time. This album, believe it or not, has sold approximately 5 million copies worldwide. This album is now 61 years old and going strong. This album probably will be available forever. It'll probably always be in print. The album actually keeps selling and sells at least 5,000 copies a week. Amazing. I own a copy of this album. You saw that one. This actually, to show you, is a mono copy. And actually, if you don't own this album, I'd probably start with the mono version. I really enjoyed it a lot more than when I first heard the stereo version, which was the first album I bought from this. Yes, I own 3 different copies of Miles Davis, and people who love Kind of Blue probably own maybe as many as a dozen different versions of it. This album is unique in that Miles Davis, just hours before the session started, he came up with the concept of what each song should be. He had how many bars it should be and the theme of the song, and they didn't rehearse this at all. They just did a take, and usually within a couple of takes they had it, and they used the entire take. So it was a really amazing album. I guess all the stars aligned, and it was truly remarkable. Obviously, the musicianship was key, but this was just a truly remarkable record, and everyone should own it, even if you don't like jazz. This album you will like, I guarantee it, so you should own it. So that's my pick for the greatest album to come out of the 1950s. If you have another album that I may have overlooked, please let me know. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, this is Alex from All About Albums. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this video and don't want to miss the next one, please hit the subscribe button below. You know what to do. And until then, keep them spinning.